On Thursday, November 13th, the Trump administration took the unprecedented step of adding four Antifa affiliated entities in Europe to the U.S. government's list of specially designated global terrorists. The administration also stated its intent to add each of these entities to the State Department's list of designated foreign terrorist organizations, or FTOs. Informed observers see the move as laying the groundwork to target organizations, activists, and the right to free speech here in the United States. Designations are an escalation in the administration's efforts to recast anti-fascist activism as a matter of national security, potentially creating far-reaching legal and political consequences. What does this new designation mean for civil liberties, for protests and nonprofit work in America, and for the legal landscape surrounding political dissent? How could these actions reshape the boundaries of permissible speech and association, both online and off? This is the Just Security Podcast. I'm your host, Tom Joscelyn, a senior fellow at Just Security. I've been in the counterterrorism field for more than 20 years, which certainly makes me feel old. Joining me today is Tom Brzozowski, a former counsel for domestic terrorism in the counterterrorism section of the U.S. Department of Justice. He recently published an article at Just Security titled "How Designating Antifa as a Foreign Terrorist Organization Could Threaten Civil Liberties." Tom published that piece with us in late October, and he clearly had this move and potential new moves in mind when he wrote it. Tom, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, happy to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Tom, I saw this move yesterday, and the first thing, as you know, via email was I had to email you to say, why don't you come on and record a podcast with us? Because this is definitely the move, as I said, you were anticipating, and a number of us were anticipating. And you did publish for us really a tour de force sort of look at all the ways that this type of move and additional moves can be used to abuse civil liberties and other rights in the U.S. And so I was thinking maybe you could just set the stage for us a little bit about kind of how unprecedented that would be and these moves potentially are, and what your concerns are about this type of action.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. And I think maybe the best approach is to scope back a little bit and assess where we are, and what got us to where we are today. So, as you know, in September, late September, the administration issued an executive order designating Antifa as a domestic terrorist organization. So that's something to kind of as a marker to hold. The administration then followed up a few days later with a national security directive, NSPM 7, which was titled Countering Domestic Terrorism and Organized Political Violence. And this directive essentially mandated federal agencies to target left-wing political activity deemed violent. This followed very closely on the heels, of course, of the assassination of Charlie Kirk. So these two instruments were out there and being kind of digested by the broader legal community in terms of what they might mean, what they might pretend. Obviously, there are a wide number of organizations in civil society that were doing the very same thing to try to determine with some degree of precision what this might entail for their respective institutions. Now, as you rightly noted yesterday, we also now have a clutch of additional designations that we've got to sort through. And these relate to foreign-based entities that are could be broadly construed to be aligned with Antifa activity. And these are all loaded terms of art, by the way, that we'll hopefully have a chance to distill, which will complicate the picture here a little bit. And so maybe we can get into a couple questions and to help the audience sort through what these new designations might portend for the future. And then I would certainly be more than willing to kind of give you not to be a prophet of doom, but to give you kind of a run through of what might transpire were the administration to designate Antifa writ large, as it were, as a foreign terrorist organization. But before we get there, it might be worthwhile to unpack precisely what the administration did yesterday in terms of designating these four entities, who they are, what they've been designated with, specifically, specially designated global terrorist designation, and what that means, and then what it might mean when they are designated as foreign terrorist organizations next week, next Thursday. Apparently that's going to happen. That's a different series of designations, and that carries different potential implications. So that's a lot. I don't mean to dictate what kind of questions to ask or anything, but I think
Oh,
before I
those are all on the
before
agenda. Don't worry. Yeah, let's take a step back here, like you said. Let's take a step back first with the executive order designating quote unquote Antifa
right,
as a domestic terrorist organization.
yeah,
Let's take that piece by piece. First of all, there is no such thing as a designation for domestic terrorist organization under the law, right? This doesn't add any legal teeth to it, claiming that this, there are already all sorts of statutory authorities in place to go after acts of terrorism on American soil, but there's no like category within the U.S. government for domestic terrorist organizations that has like it's not the equivalent of a foreign terrorist organization, in other words.
right.
So,
And that's why I wanted to start there. That's why I wanted to start there, to kind of give folks a feel for what the legal architecture looks like. So I've just described two mechanisms whereby the administration can designate entities: the SDGT, specially designated global terrorist organization designation, which is we'll talk about that in a second, and then the FTO designation process. Neither of those are in play when we're talking about purely domestic terrorist organizations. That is to say, there is no law presently that exists that would allow for the designation of a purely domestic terrorist organization. And so that does raise the question of what precisely does this executive order actually do? And from a legal perspective, it does nothing really. It's a legal nullity, in the sense that, again, it does not confer additional investigative authorities on the FBI. It doesn't create some sort of new law that allows the government to go after domestic terrorism organizations or anything like that. But what it does do significantly is create the specter of Antifa writ large as a designated domestic terrorist organization. Even though it has no legal teeth, the broader public, including probably large components of civic society, probably aren't necessarily aware of that. All they see is an executive order issued by the president, designated Antifa, writ large, by the way, not in a discrete particular cell of Antifa, but the all of Antifa, as they define it, as a domestic terrorist organization. And so that obviously creates a considerable chilling effect, all that cascades across civil society, which we'll talk about here in a bit. So that's the number one thing. So that's the EO.
and let me just interject one quick thing there too. And you said as they define it. Um, of course, they haven't defined Antifa. They just say Antifa or they just use
Well,
they
that's
haven't
true.
they don't have any kind of like schematic or map. Like, all these different foreign terrorist organizations that I'm sure you've dealt with through the years, where there is a hierarchy, a leadership, infrastructure, funding, training, those sorts of things. None of that is in play here in terms of how they've moved forward with this. They haven't actually defined or set forth any of that. Certainly not in the executive order defining Antifa as a domestic terrorist organization. So they just throw
Well,
this
that's
out label.
true. It's true, but in it should be noted, however, they did define it in the context of federal process in a recent case in which they indicted a couple of individuals associated with the Prairie Land ICE attack. And
Yeah,
so there,
that's the July 4th Alvarado, Texas case. And I read that indictment and I didn't see any definition there either, by the way. So they kind of, to me, they basically put that on top of the allegations against this group and didn't actually, they just said it was Antifa and didn't actually, you know, build out how it's Antifa or how these,
oh no, you're
right.
absolutely right. They
Yeah.
didn't offer any particular evidence or intelligence that suggests these individuals are affiliated with Antifa, but they did make a stab at defining it as a network of networks of individuals affiliated with militant anarchism and autonomous Marxism. I think was something along the lines of what they offered. But again, to your broader point, no
Which is
intelligence or
gibberish, right? I mean, it's not
right.
really, it's not an actual definition. I mean, the point is like you and I have dealt in the counterterrorism world for a long time, right? And so when you see, an actual terrorist entity, right, there are certain things you look for and how you define it and think about it, right? And the point here is with Antifa, they haven't done any of the work to do that, to show that there's an actual organization with a hierarchy, or even show how it's cohesive or how this is an actual entity that is a cohesive entity across the United States, let alone internationally, which I think is a key point here because they're trying to treat it as if it is such, with these moves.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly right. And I think the danger here that has been noted pretty broadly is what they appear to be hanging their hat on is more of the ideological underpinning of a disparate group of otherwise unconnected connected people and networks that hew to a common philosophy, which is so immensely broad. Anti-fascism. I mean, I'm anti-fascist. I'll admit it. I'm a card-carrying anti-fascist. And so, and then that's the only connective tissue that really holds this notion of Antifa together. And so, but again, you're totally right. No structure, no organization, no hierarchy, none of that. And so we've got that. That's kind of spinning in the background. We got this EO. No one really knows with any degree of precision what precisely that means. Is there a mechanism within the DOJ to designate entities now? Is there now a blacklist of entities that have been designated that we don't know about? Who knows? Nobody knows. Are they going to publish this? Is that going to make it? Are we going to have some feel for what the criteria to make it on this list might be? We don't know because they haven't said anything more about it. So there's that spinning in the background, and then of course on its heels comes the NSPD uh, 7, NSPM 7, sorry, which concerns this sort of ominous sounding countering domestic terrorism and organized political violence, which of course does the work of putting together the words domestic terrorism and organized political violence, and spelling out for people what they should JTTFs, what they should be on the lookout. Why is this important? Just a couple key things on this one that attracted my attention in particular detail. Directing the JTTFs to target organized political violence is pretty significant in the fact that consider who's on the JTTFs. It's not just local law enforcement, or I'm sorry, it's not just federal law enforcement. It's not just the interagency. The JTTF, by definition, includes, of course, state and local law enforcement. So by designating the JTTF as sort of the tip of the spear on this, what are you doing? You're in effect incentivizing state and local leaders to get on board with this particular directive and bring on board their respective authorities that now can be brought to bear in addition to the federal authorities that might be available. And then, of course, there's a lot of language in there directing the IRS and Treasury and other entities to leverage their respective authorities to root out what is perceived to be some sort of organized, orchestrated political violence, largely attributable to what we would understand to be a left-wing political agenda.
Yeah, I mean,
So
when I
that's
read totally, I mean, when I read the National Security Memorandum and I wrote a piece about this, I mean, the big thing that if you're familiar with how Joint Terrorism Task Force and the FBI previously opened up investigations and did their work, there was a bright red line between political advocacy and even advocacy for noxious ideas on the one hand, and actual involvement or criminal activity surrounding violent attacks or any actual criminal attacks and criminal activity as defined by the law. And when I read the National Security Memorandum 7, which was obviously by the number, it's only the seventh one they put out so far, giving you how important they deem this to be, um, it crossed that line, right? I mean, there's a paragraph in there that lists a lot of different sort of ideological beliefs, including anti-capitalism, anti-Christianity, anti-Americanism, all sorts of things that are typically considered ideas that people could advocate without having any kind of involvement or advocacy for violence, by the way, or involvement in violence whatsoever. And yet now these are listed in National Security Memorandum 7 as indicia, supposedly indicia or indications of sort of a violent threat or political violence, right? And that crosses a line, to my mind anyway, in terms of how this all goes. So it was an escalation here, as you've rightly set forth here for us. You have first the designation or the executive order designating Antifa as a domestic terrorist organization. One of the reasons when you go through the literature on this that the FBI and others have not set forth such a list is because of the First Amendment concerns, because you very quickly can, and you find yourself on a slippery slope where you're violating groups or individuals' First Amendment rights if you go down that road. They started going down that road. They escalate that with National Security Memorandum 7, which now opens the door, to my eyes, to have these Joint Terrorism Task Force, which includes these cross-agency components, as you've said, to investigate entities and people for things that go beyond the normal violent or criminal activity that would normally, instigate investigations in the past. Now, I think if there's anything else you want to add on necessary memorandum 7 before we move on.
Just the only thing I would note before we actually get to what we're supposed to talk about today, but this is good background. It's necessary background
No,
because
I'm glad you went down this road. I mean, I think, I'm a nerd. I like to, go right to the new nerdy details. So this is good scene setting for the whole thing. So that's good.
yeah, but remember, this is all taking the ether. This is all taking part in the atmospherics around this are not to be ignored either. There are statements by senior administration officials, the vice president, the president himself, suggesting that in organizations like Open Society, Ford Foundation, Soros Foundation, should be actively investigated. There are references by the vice president to specific NGOs and nonprofits like the Anti-Defamation League or SPLC that should be specifically investigated. That's not nothing. That, when read in the context of these two documents, it accelerates this latent, it's no longer latent, but palpable fear amongst many in the civic society that they could very well be next. And there's no way to know if you're not next. It's because of the vague nature of both these documents. So that's all I'll say about that. And so that kind of sets the table for, and then in my piece was more of a kind of a taking up a hypothetical. Should the administration choose to designate Antifa writ large, and I say writ large by without just the entire thing, just Antifa, defining it as broadly as possible, as a foreign terrorist organization, what implications might flow therefrom? And so that was my piece. But yesterday, as I noted before, we've got the administration now designating four entities as specially designated global terrorist entities.
And let's talk about your piece for a second before we even get to the four entities that are
Yeah,
designated.
sure.
Because the reason why your piece is so important, I think, is that the domestic terrorist organization label put on Antifa on this executive order, as we've explained, doesn't have any legal teeth, right? There's no sort of playbook they can then unleash on organizations or entities with that label. If you start labeling Antifa writ large or sub Antifa groups, so to speak, and again, there's all sorts of squishy definitional problems here. But if you start down that road, the FTO designations, for example, do open up a whole new playbook of tools that the U.S. government has to go after individuals and organizations. So there are legal teeth to an FTO designation that do not exist for a domestic terrorist organization label, which is why that would be such an escalation. And you rightfully noted that President Trump, had said that he wanted to do this. He wanted to label Antifa as an FTO, foreign terrorist organization, and they've now started down that path with these four European supposed groups involved in violence. Do I have that right? I mean, is that basically that there is an escalation going from the EO with the domestic terrorist organization label, which has no legal teeth, to an FTO status? And you, as an expert in what Department of Justice and other entities can do, that's really where the concern is.
Oh, for sure. And so you can see it does appear that there's a glide path happening here. And again, you got to consider this in the context of the ether and the atmospherics as well. There was an Antifa roundtable that the White House held, whereby during that roundtable, there were folks that pressed the president on camera to designate Antifa as a foreign terrorist organization. He turned to Secretary Rubio and said, "Hey, let's get this done." So that you could sort of see the wheels starting to turn. And so it was only a matter of time that the administration, like this, this Secretary of State is probably not going to, he's going to give effect to what the president directed him to do in some form or fashion. And so now we see these new designations of these four entities. But in truth, it's pretty clear to me that using these foreign designations is really sort of a backdoor to get at the domestic Antifa movement, as it were, indirectly. Because you can say that now, we can get into the meat of this, but any U.S. Antifa entity that's tied in any which way to these foreign terrorists, as you were, are now subject to the full freight of the full legal arsenal that can be kind of loaded up and to target Americans who are in any way linked up with these overseas networks. And there's all sorts of different ways that can actually transpire that we can get into down the road. So I think this is certainly a glide path that we're on. My piece, I just want to distinguish clearly for folks that my piece concerned the potential for the administration designating all of Antifa as a foreign terrorist organization. So I don't want folks to be confused, like, oh, did it happen? Is your parade of horribles now like in full effect right now? And the good news is it's not yet. There are still very real implications that are going to flow from what transpired yesterday, I suspect, especially when these entities are designated as foreign terrorist organizations next week, to be sure. But the whole, again, parade of horribles has not quite come to pass yet, because the entities that have been designated so far are fairly small networks that operate almost entirely in Europe and overseas.
Yeah, I mean, let's. You mentioned, you brought up a couple times now the Antifa roundtable at the White House, and one of the comments that was made there, I think, really kind of illuminates the reality versus the specter that they're trying to create, which is, Kristi Noem, Secretary of Department of Homeland Security, claimed that Antifa is as significant a threat as Al Qaeda, ISIS, and Hezbollah. Right now,
And Hamas too.
and Hamas, right? If you know anything about these terrorist organizations, you know that that is an absolutely ludicrous claim, right? On its face, it's not, doesn't get you past go. There's no real material debate to be had there. You're talking about, terrorist organizations that have committed some of the largest terrorist attacks in history against civilians, murdering thousands of civilians at a time. You're also talking about terrorist organizations that are insurgencies that have contested for and won ground in countries around the world, against governments, have toppled regimes. There's just simply no comparison between those organizations and what we're talking about here as Antifa. And I thought about that comment, though, when these new designations were announced yesterday, because the gap between Al Qaeda, ISIS, Hezbollah, and Hamas and these four groups could not be any larger. So let's talk a little bit about the four groups that they're talking. And again, when we say groups, we have to use that as a loose term here, like how much organization is actually behind any of these entities. It's something they have not shown, they have not proven. But let's talk a little bit about the four entities that they're targeting. The first one I noticed is known as Antifa East, or the Hammer Gang. Um, the last violence attributed to that in the State Department's announcement to this entity is in 2023 in Hungary, in Budapest. Um, Anybody who knows anything about that, I don't know if people know what that's all about, but that was, these Antifa adherents showed up as counter protesters to a rally that is organized by neo Nazis every February 11th of every year in Hungary, in Budapest. And this Antifa East, or the Hammer Gang, this supposed group, is being designated by the Trump administration. But the actual far right neo Nazis who organized that rally, who also engaged in violence on the streets with these counter protesters, according, by the way, to the State Department itself, um, is not being designated. So Blood and Honor, which is the far right neo Nazi group that actually holds this rally every year in Budapest, has been designated by the Canadian government as a terrorist organization, as well as its armed wing Combat 18. Has been banned in Germany, Spain, France. Well, France had some, hasn't been banned, I don't think formally, but has had some actions taken against it. In any event, to me, it sure shows the game here is afoot, right? Like they're going after what they claim is this international terrorist menace in Antifa. And the first group out of the box is Antifa East, or the Hammer Gang, which has been involved in very low level violence. I mean, there has been some violence attributed to it, and the German government has cracked down on it. Um, and it's based in Germany. But they're not going after the neo-Nazi group, which is far larger and has also committed acts of violence, in this context. So I think kind of it puts everything into stark relief here for me, anyway. What do you think about all that?
No, you're absolutely correct. Again, and I think just starting with the notion that senior officials in government are affiliating or attempting to draw an equivalence between Antifa, which they really struggle to even define, and Hamas is ludicrous. And what it does is it underscores where we are with regard to counterterrorism operations in this current environment, and it's unfortunate. And this clearly is um, uh, a reflexive designation by the State Department. Well, in this case, the SDGT, of course, this is Treasury. The initial tranche are Treasury related, but the forthcoming FTOs will be out of state and next week, in order to give effect to what the president has directed. So this is, and again, this is, the way this whole process is working is backwards, and the sequencing is all wrong here. I mean, typically you're going to have an intelligence picture that is drawn up, a dossier compiled by State Department, based on real national security threats to the United States. That's one of the factors for an FTO designation, by the way. Um, and then
Well, just on
that's
that point, Tom,
yeah.
one of the omissions, right, in the announcement, and I noticed this right away too, as I'm sure you did, is that there are no alleged attacks on Americans or against Americans
No,
in this announcement. And there's no plots against Americans
no,
or
not
Americans.
whatsoever. And there's no
Uh,
American involvement whatsoever.
right,
These are all
right,
discrete, like fairly localized networks that operate overseas. I'm not marginalizing the violence that's attributed to
sure,
them. There is violence attributed to them, to be sure. But again, you got to make a showing that there's a national security threat to the United States. That's one of the factors here. For the FTO piece anyway.
right.
I don't see that here. I don't think any professional, and I think even the folks at state know this, and I don't want to speak for them, and they're doing their best, I'm sure, but come on, they're put in a bind. They got to deliver, or else they're going to get fired. And that's unfortunate that's how the process is working. But the sequencing is all backwards at this point. And that's dangerous because this is really political theater is what this is. This is giving effect to a presidential directive, in it's looking to appeal to their base. And again, I don't want to get too far afield from the main conversation here, but I think it's important to note also I'm not suggesting that the spasmodic violence we've seen since the president's inauguration is not real. It's a thing. I think there clearly is a surge of domestic terrorism. A lot of people are using political violence. That's domestic terrorism, to be sure. I'm just trying to trying to lump it all under this broad category, this umbrella category of Antifa is wrong-headed, and it's just not good intelligence work, because you're not able to tease out some of the animating impulses of this. You're just lumping it all into one category for political expediency, and that's that. It makes no sense from an analytical perspective at all. And of course, your intelligence is supposed to drive your operations and your resources. And so, if you've got faulty intelligence being directed top down as opposed to organically, where it's supposed to be at the analyst level, the entire superstructure is going to be disordered, and that's where we're at. But anyway, I digress.
No, no. I mean that's crucial. I mean that's why I harp on they haven't really really defined Antifa because originally I was a counterterrorism nerd and analyst who I'm all about the
Well,
details,
then
right?
shoot, you know this better than I do.
Right.
Yeah,
Well, I mean, in terms of defining it, they haven't done that work to define it, right?
yeah.
And they haven't actually done the type of work that would be done on any of these other groups that Christy Noem mentioned or had been done on those groups to actually figure out how they work and how they are actually international organizations that do pose a threat to the U.S. national security and Americans around the globe, including inside the U.S. All that work that had been done in the past, let's say even since the late 1990s. That has not been done here. That is not what you're seeing here, and that's not what's reflected in these announcements. And what you're seeing is much more of a political, ideological game afoot, which is to try and, as you said, take this process, try and hem this spasmodic political violence under this FTO designation in order to go after potentially domestic political entities that are simply just opposed to the Trump administration's actions. And on that, and that's, in that regard, to something you said earlier, you said, you're anti-fascist. I mean, America is supposed to be anti-fascist, right? So, and none of that means that anyone here is excusing, as you said, any kind of political violence or any of these violent acts whatsoever. The point is that the government has the tools to go after political violence, has the tools to go after domestic terrorism without putting this infrastructure on top of the whole thing, without superimposing all this nonsense on top of it, which is what they're trying to do. And, when it comes to Antifa East, for example, or the Hammer Gang, this was clearly something they did in coordination with Viktor Orban's authoritarian regime in Hungary, because this is his game, right? He enables the neo-Nazis to come in and organize their rally every year. They're fine, right? And they commit acts of violence on the streets too. But it's the Antifa counter protesters. They're the ones that Hungary tried to launch this European-wide manhunt, which you reference in your piece, by the way, for Just Security, against Antifa adherents who came to counter protest. And that's not excusing any violence that they committed whatsoever. But that's sort of the game that's afoot here. It's not based on a bottom-up analysis of the facts or the actual threats to Americans. It's much more in this political ideological realm.
Totally. I mean, and again, it's notable that Hungary is to date the only European government to actually designate Antifa in the same way. We super nerd out on some of the fact that some of these other European countries don't really necessarily have lists like we have. Their designation and sanctions regimes are slightly different, but even so, your larger point is exactly correct. And moreover, Hungary and a handful of other European countries made noises in the immediate aftermath of the initial executive order designating Antifa, looking to sort of follow suit. And so again, this raises the specter of some sort of effort by a handful of countries to raise the specter of a global Antifa sort of network that operates transnationally, which again is not something we'd really ever seen. It's certainly not anywhere on the order of the transnational dimensions of organizations like previous organizations like the Base, or like these sort of neo-Nazi, like right-wing organizations like the Base or Atomwaffen,
Or
or any of
Blood
these
and
other.
Honor, which actually
Love and
organizes.
honor, absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. You're totally right. And so, the notion that the administration is spending all its capital on running to ground these entities is a little, it's disheartening, especially when we have like real syndicates, shadowy online network syndicates like 764 and some of these, the
Yep.
Com and some of these other organizations that, right, designate those guys. Spend your time on running those guys to ground. They're doing real harm. But yeah, I think your point is certainly well taken. And so now the concern is this could be somewhat like a fanciful notion, but these days nothing's fanciful, and anything might transpire. Is the administration considering now looking at these designations and in effect bootstrapping them with a view towards possibly designating Antifa writ large in the United States as a foreign terrorist organization? May happen, may not happen. Maybe they're done here. Maybe it's mission accomplished. They satisfied what they need to do, and hopefully that's the case. But maybe not. And if they don't, that brings into question the piece that I wrote for you guys in Just Security and the implications that flow therefrom.
Yeah, let's get those in just 1 minute. I just want to wrap up these three other groups on this list here from the
Yeah,
state. Um, just from studying this from the past, I mean, the second one is the Informal Anarchist Federation,
yeah,
otherwise known as the International Revolutionary Front. I mean, that is a real thing. It's existed for a long time. My analysis of that group, there are other people have done deep dives on it. I haven't, but that thing predates that group, or that entity predates the Antifa movement by a good amount, I think. And to lump it in with quote unquote Antifa here in the US, or trying to at least rhetorically do so, strikes me as odd. Yeah, I mean, they still have a broad, sort of, I guess they're probably broad agreement in some of the ways that they would approach matters. But even in the State Department's notice, it says since 2003, which of course predates the violence that they're attributing to it, predates the Antifa movement here in the US by a considerable degree. At least the ones that people would think about. So this is really a separate sort of entity that the Italian government has, in fact, cracked down on and has actually brought its members to justice. I wonder if you had anything to say about that before we.
yeah. I think you're right, and I'm looking at my notes here, and I'm not I've certainly studied a lot of these organizations over my many years, but I can't pretend to be like a super expert on it. But even so, just some cursory research on these organizations suggests exactly what you're saying. I mean, consider the two Greek groups that were
Yep.
similarly sanctioned. Same situation. But it's interesting to note that again, there was a time when the U.S. actually did designate some of these similar Greek institutions, some left wing anarchist sort of collectives. But you know why they designated them back in the 70s and 80s? Because they assassinated U.S. officials. Like they murdered them overseas. Here, they're again sanctioning or designating these small tiny collectives that are engaged in some violence, to be sure, in Europe, but it's very localized. And then suggesting that this is part of some sort of broader, as I said before, broader global enterprise. And again, let's consider the atmospherics. There's been a lot of discussion by senior officials about leveraging things like RICO, for example, where you got to prove the enterprise in fact, and suggesting that, again, this is all suggesting or hinting at some sort of shadowy global network that exists, which is absurd, as you and I both know, and most counterterrorism officials know full well.
Yeah, I mean, just to put a fine point on it before we move back to your piece and wrap up with that analysis, which I think is really crucially important. The last supposed group on this list, the fourth four, is Revolutionary Class Self-Defense. This is a relatively newly announced organization. There are two IED attacks. Again, nobody's excusing those or saying that they're fine. They need to be brought to justice for those. That this group has claimed responsibility for since 2024. I looked, contrary to Kristi Noem's threat inflation and the threat inflation we're seeing across the Trump administration from this, neither one of those IED attacks resulted in any casualties. They were, let alone deaths, and neither of them were targeting Americans or American interests either, right? So this is very low level affair so far. And to me, it just speaks to they're trying to find some way to lump all these together with quote unquote Antifa to try and build a case. But if you actually examine each link in the story, each one of the links is broken. So if you have anything to add on that before we move on to your piece, I don't know.
No, I think I think we sufficiently covered the
Yeah,
the
how
four
weak
destinations.
weak tea.
But the broader point is, hey, look, they're not even stopping here. We got to, we don't have time to get into it here, but they're starting with the SDGT, which is a sanctions based,
That's under Executive Order 13224. It was something that was ramped up after 9/11 and used to go after Al Qaeda and affiliated groups. And
yeah, but it's really, yeah, and what it bars, it cuts these entities off from the U.S. financial system in effect, and kind of, so it definitely has teeth for sure, but it's nowhere near the FTO designation. That, as you know, that's under the INA, under 219 INA, which is a separate statutory measure, but that brings on board potent criminal, a potent criminal regime, specifically 18 U.S.C. 2339B, material support, which, that's a 20-year hit right there, a 20-year felony potentially. So, I mean, that's coming. So they're doing both against these very sort of small, tiny networks. And I'm not discounting the violence associated with them for sure. But what are we doing? Like, why are these FTO? This is the first time any sort of Antifa related or left wing type of organization has been designated as an FTO, as far as I'm aware. I mean, you can make the case that maybe some organizations in South America could broadly be construed as left wing, but even so, the broader point is this is massive overkill, and it's an effort to try to stitch up or create facts on the ground that suggest a global enterprise that does not exist.
Exactly. Totally agree. Now let's get to your piece, because this is the meat and potatoes really of the conversation, which I was anxious to run to, because what you did was, I think you provide a very meticulous analysis of the ways potentially that going down the FTO path, the foreign terrorist organization path, opens up a sort of a Pandora's box of goodies for the administration to play with if they want to go after domestic political entities. And again, this is all assuming, which I think is a completely righteous assumption, that they're not going to act in good faith with all this, or under good faith in terms of how they're trying to define the supposed terrorist threat. Maybe you could walk people through the different ways you see that this process could, you say glide path or slippery slope, could be abused by the Trump administration against people here in the U.S. domestically.
Sure. Well, I mentioned the first bit, of course, already, namely the criminal sanctions that attend to designating an Antifa as a foreign terrorist organization. Those are 20-year. That's a 20-year violation. It's a 20-year felony. And for anybody or any entity that provides, again, material support to Antifa. And so the problem here, of course, is Antifa, if it's not specifically defined, can effectively mean whatever the administration wants it to mean. And material support, folks need to remember, is vast. It covers a whole range of activity, including providing financial resources, providing legal resources to an entity, providing, so it's not just like providing weapons to an entity. And all you got to do is make a showing that the individual knew that they were providing that material support to Antifa. But if no one really knows what Antifa is, how are they going to really be in a position to know if they're providing the material support? So I'm not suggesting that, this would result in some whole, like hundreds of prosecutions of individuals for providing material support. That doesn't need to happen. It just needs to introduce the specter of a potential investigation, criminal investigation, and then they've done their work. That's all they need to do. And as I note in my piece here, consider the tremendous strain that would put on any individual or organization just by being under active FBI investigation. You'd be effectively bankrupted right out of the gate. So, and then the institutional, the loss of like your public facing institutional, the publicity associated with it. If you're under active investigation by the FBI as potentially providing material support to a foreign terrorist organization, like what, that's not good. And then quickly running through the other again, I do feel like a prophet of doom here a little bit, but
All right. These are you were clear. These are hypotheticals. That this is like,
these are hypotheticals. It hasn't happened yet, and hopefully we won't get here. But there are immigration consequences that a lot of folks probably need to consider. Again, under the INA, any non-citizen who's a member or representative of a designated foreign terrorist organization is automatically going to be inadmissible. It can be removed. You could be denaturalized. Naturalized U.S. citizens potentially could be denaturalized. And again, that's if they are found to be affiliated with a foreign terrorist organization. But if you don't know with any degree of precision what Antifa is, how do you know whether you might inadvertently be affiliated with Antifa? Like what if you go to an ICE protest, like an anti-ICE protest? Like what if you, is that a sufficient basis? I mean, it's really the fear that this engenders more than anything that I think is the biggest harm. But then there's also potential, like if you're an institution, any institution, a civic organization, non-governmental organization, academic institution, consider the civil liability that might attach under the Anti-Terrorism Act, because this would allow anybody that is injured by reason of an act of international terrorism committed by a designated FTO to sue for triple damages and attorney's fees. And again, like this scenario could be a situation where, again, if you don't know if you're at a protest or a protest activity, and somebody next to you, is involved in a scuffle with an ICE officer or something like that, and you're injured, and you could sue that, not only that individual, but if that individual had attended a training that was put on like 3 weeks prior by some sort of university or a non-governmental organization, you could sue them too. And again, even if the suits are don't go anywhere, it's the specter of litigation that's going to cause a cascading effect across society. Because a lot of these institutions, they have to get insurance. They're how do you measure risk in that type of scenario if you're an underwriter? And so you're all the way, the tentacles have extended all the way down to underwriters who are assessing risk. Like how do we provide insurance to this institution if we can't be sure that we're going to be subject to civil liability or the possibility of suit? So there's that. There's a potential for FISA surveillance. And I mean, remember, like if Antifa is designated FTO, we are now in the realm of international terrorism. So we are no longer in dealing with domestic terrorism. And folks need to understand that in the main, what distinguishes domestic terrorism investigations primarily from international terrorism investigations is the fact that domestic terrorism investigations don't have the full arsenal of investigative tools available to them. Things like using FISA or national security letters or things like that aren't typically unavailable in the context of domestic terrorism investigations. Rightly so, because domestic terrorism investigations typically involve American citizens on U.S. soil. But if you're onboarding this FTO designation, now the aperture opens, and FISA becomes a potential tool that could be leveraged by the government in connection with international terrorism investigations. And then, of course, as I've already alluded to, you're going to see this hit different sectors in different ways. Like consider the social media companies. Like how are they going to organize themselves in connection with this, with a potential designation, a foreign terrorist organization, a foreign FTO designation of Antifa? Like you're going to see a pretty considerable pullback in terms of content. How do they ensure that their platform isn't isn't hosting content that could be broadly construed as anti-fascist in nature. What does that even mean? Like, how do you calibrate whether content is anti-fascist potentially? And it's not as if they're going to hew directly to the letter of the law. They're going to be overly cautious and pull down content that is anywhere that has anything to do with any kind of flavor of anti-fascism. And again, this redounds all the way back to our initial conversation about what is we're all anti-fascist. So what kind of content is actually going to be disallowed on the majority of platforms that exist in America? And how is that going to then in turn shape the information ecosystem that most Americans use to consume the type of information they need to be a participant in a democratic society? So that's threading the needle all the way back to the individual end user on a TikTok account that typically looks to TikTok to get their news to make informed decisions about who to elect in the next election cycle. I can go on and on and on here, but I mean, I think people are kind of getting the flavor of how this.
I
This
think that does a good job of summarizing. I mean, people have to read the piece for themselves to get a
yeah,
full
yeah,
sense. I mean, again, it's how designating Antifa as a foreign terrorist organization could threaten civil liberties. And Tom Brzozowski, our guest for today, he authored that in late October, kind of giving you the hypothetical worst case scenario of what they could do if once they start invoking these types of authorities. And again, it's a really a great, I think, succinct compendium of all the different ways that the Trump administration could abuse this. So I want to thank you again, Tom, for joining us on today's episode. I'm going to leave it here and leave your piece as sort of people to go read for themselves if they want to get more worried, I guess. So,
yeah, I was getting a little worked up there, but I appreciate it and thanks for having me on.
no, thank you. This episode was hosted by me, Tom Joscelyn. I'm a senior fellow at Just Security. It was produced by Maya Neer, my wonderful colleague, with the help of Isaac Rubenstein. Special thanks again to our guest, Tom Brzozowski, for his great work for us at Just Security and elsewhere. You can read all of Just Security's coverage on terrorism and counterterrorism on our website. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to this show. Thank you very much.